Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Introduction to Forensic Science Week 1 Google Hangout, coming to you live from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. Today we will be putting your questions to Professor Jim Fraser, discussing Week 1 of the course, Principles and Practice of Crime Scene Investigation. Due to the rail network currently being suspended in Scotland due to extreme weather, Professor Fraser has kindly agreed to join us from his home in central Scotland. While we don't anticipate any issues, we hope you bear with us as Jim will be supported by colleagues through the Hangout at a distance. Please feel free to ask questions using the Google Hangout question bar, and we will do our best to pass along as many of your questions as we can. You can also post your questions on Twitter using the hashtag FLForensic. And now, without further ado, I will now hand you over to Professor Fraser, who will host our Google Hangout session.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome from a very stormy and windy Scotland. Those of you who are local will know that. Thanks very much to Aidan for his introduction there. And as he said, we'll be consolidating and dealing with some of the issues that you've raised about the first week of the MOOC on Principles and Practice of Crime Scene Investigation. Thank you very much to all those who posted questions. I've been through those questions, and I've looked to pull out questions that have that generate lots of interest for a number of people. So I've made a point of not just answering them in any kind of sequence, but picking questions that are rich and which have been posted by, or at least a number of people have shown an interest in. So my first question was posted by James Dunn. In fact, it's more a comment from James than it is a question. And there were also additional comments or likes from other people. I think we've got 17 likes. And Louisa Andrade and Elizabeth Gaffin have also commented on this question or on this issue. And what the point James wants to make, and James is a former police officer, is that there are structural issues in policing and forensic practice that are important here. In particular, James refers to the kind of austerity climate that we're in at the moment, where most organisations, and particularly public sector organisations, are under financial pressure to control their costs and become more efficient. He also refers to the fact that relatively recently forensic science in England and Wales was privatised, and he makes the comment that he would like students to be conscious that these factors have some role to play in relation to crime scene investigation, and he's quite right. But let me make some responses to those observations from James. The first one I would make is that the general principle at any crime scene is to recover anything that appears to be relevant. Now, deciding what's relevant can be quite a tricky business. It depends on training, knowledge, experience, intuition, even imagination to a degree. But what it doesn't mean, which is perhaps something that some people may have the impression, is that it doesn't mean that literally everything is recovered. If you think about what that might mean, then if you recovered everything and tried to analyse everything, then you would simply swamp laboratories and police organisations with items and produce nothing. But that balance between recovering on the face of it everything and recovering what's actually relevant generally means that the selection processes tend to very much favour over-collection rather than under-collection. So it's quite typical that a very large number of items will be taken in a case, but only a proportion of them examined. It's very different to give you any real indication, but perhaps from my experience, typically maybe in the region of 50, 60 or 70 items might be examined in a homicide case, of the perhaps many hundreds that would be collected, and they're examined on the basis of their relevance to the investigation, their relevance to forming a prosecution case, or their ability to eliminate witnesses or potential suspects. So what austerity has done in relation to that really is it's really kind of focused everyone's mind, made these decisions really rather more challenging perhaps, and requiring far more discussion and reflection about what needs to be done rather than what might be just convenient to do. So very good point from James there about the need to think seriously about what needs to be examined. I want to come on to two more points that are particularly relevant in England and Wales. I need to explain, perhaps before I do that, that the UK, the United Kingdom, has more than one legal jurisdiction, and it actually has three. It has England and Wales, two countries, but one legal jurisdiction, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and these are three different legal systems. Just to confuse things, of course, there is law which is UK law as well, but for the most part, the criminal law is local. In other words, the criminal law in England can be quite different from the criminal law in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. And the Forensic Science Service that James refers to in his questions, that was privatised a few years ago and then subsequently closed, was an organisation that operated in England and Wales. There isn't a United Kingdom Forensic Science Service. In Scotland, there is a public sector laboratory that's responsible for the provision of forensic services nationally in Scotland, and there is another public sector laboratory in England and Wales that's responsible for it. And of course, that privatisation has also focused police minds in England and Wales in terms of how they decide what needs to be examined and the potential costs that things might incur during the course of an examination. Now, this ought not to compromise an investigation, but there are possibilities that it may do so. Only time will tell. One response that the police have made in England and Wales to this issue is to do far more forensic work themselves, and in fact many forensic scientists who used to work for the Forensic Science Service now work for police organisations, and again only time will tell what that really means and whether it presents any real risks for the administration of justice. So thanks to James for those observations and for raising those issues. I should just make perhaps one final comment in relation to privatised forensic services. There are privatised forensic services in most countries in the world, to my understanding, but England and Wales is the only country that privatised their kind of national provision. So it's a difference in scale rather than a difference in practice. The second question comes from TM. TM hasn't chosen to give us his full name, and is kind of endorsed, or there are comments from Tim Barr, Elizabeth Hudson, Susan Starton, and Rosemary Winfield, and then there's a whole load of likes to go with it as well. And this relates to the perennial evergreen question about media portrayals of forensic science, forensic practice, and perhaps even policing. And the question that is posed by TM is, how good a job is the media doing? Well, let's start by saying the media's job is not necessarily to portray forensic practice as it actually is. It depends on what part of the media you're really talking about. If we talk about the kind of factual media, perhaps the better newspapers or the better types of investigative journalism or documentaries, well, they should be more driven by facts than perhaps speculation. But the truth of the matter is that any media kind of organ, whether it's a visual one or a print one, is limited by space and time, and they are required to get their message and their story across to the public with these constraints. So inevitably there will be a loss of detail in some instances, and they will perhaps a bit more focus on providing an interesting narrative or an interesting account rather than being completely and absolutely factually accurate. But there are many good portrayals in a documentary sense, but my general experience is that there can be a loss of detail there, and perhaps some misunderstandings that come out in those circumstances. So you can't necessarily rely even on the factual media to portray an accurate context. When it comes to the non-factual media, again, whether it's in print or whether it's televisual, film, or so on. Well, the purpose of that kind of media is entertainment, really, and they're not under any obligation to stick to the facts. What's the old Hollywood quote? Let's not let the facts get in the way of the good story. And some will use some kind of factual information to perhaps act as a framework for a story. But in many instances, the portrayals, the presentations, both of the characters and the roles, and even the kind of timescales, is very, very different from reality. So that's not a criticism. The purpose of that kind of media is to entertain. It's something to enjoy rather than to educate. So I guess my summary in relation to that question is that you can't rely on the media hugely for informed accounts about forensic practice. And I guess I ought to mention something which you may have come across, and I'm fairly sure we mentioned in subsequent weeks, something called the CSI effect, which is a genuine phenomenon. This is the idea that there are so many media portrayals, particularly fictional portrayals of forensic science, forensic practice, how crime scenes are managed, that there is a very high expectation in the minds of both jurors and many legal personnel that forensic evidence will always be available and will always be of a particular type and quality. And of course we know that's not the case. I've been involved in quite a large number of high-profile crimes where there is very limited forensic evidence. The absence of forensic evidence does not mean there is no case to answer, or that a prosecution won't take place. So the CSI effect is a real phenomenon that if you speak to prosecutors or police officers, you will find they're aware of it and have to deal with it. The next question comes from Gail Williams, and it is also kind of has been linked to comments by Corey van der Stage, or Stege, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that name, Debbie Catterall, and again there's quite a number of likes attached to this question. And it's a really interesting question which we will approach in more detail later on in the MOOC. And the comment that Gail makes, or the question she raises, is that, well, is it not human nature to have a theory before you have facts? So this idea that you formulate a hypothesis, then you collect facts, then you test the hypothesis, and then you reject it or accept it on the basis of that. Well, again, you're absolutely right, Gail, and those who have commented on it. It is human nature to kind of speculate and imagine this way. In fact, I think evolutionary psychologists would say the brain is kind of wired to do that. We are not designed to stand back and constantly be reflective and gather evidence before we make decisions. We are designed, if I can use that word about evolution, to respond really quite quickly, particularly in what might be dangerous circumstances, without too much thought and without necessarily too much evidence. So what does that mean for the business of crime scene investigation and the business of investigating crime more generally? Well, what it means is that these speculative imaginings, which are very powerful and in many instances are potentially the mechanisms where a good explanation of how a crime took place come from, need to be kept in very careful control. And that's done by a whole range of means. It's done by careful going back over the theory with the evidence to see if the evidence actually fits the facts, challenging that theory in a very kind of structured way. That often takes place in team meetings and team briefings, where different people will have different views and will naturally challenge each other's accounts. And that's part of the process, the ongoing process of a crime scene now, and also an investigation. Now, a crime scene, it's very much a live event. There's lots of dialogue, there's lots of discussions, and at the same time, that whole process runs continually through the length of an investigation. I'd like to finish in relation to that comment by saying that it can in fact be quite a big problem for cases. And for those of you who want to look into this, I recommend an author, a writer called Kim Rosmo, who's a Canadian former police officer, who has written a book called, I think it's called Investigative Failures. And he has dedicated a whole chapter to what he calls cognitive failures or cognitive biases, where individual prejudices or embedded hypotheses have somehow overcome what ought to happen in an investigation to make sure that it remains on the rails and does not become in some way a kind of, in inverted commas, potential witch hunt. Okay. Now I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Regina Mansour, and with comments from Amanda Mitchell. And Regina's raised the extraordinary events that have taken place in Paris. In fact, not taken place, but will continue to unfold as this day goes on. Now, plainly, I've got nothing to say about Paris. I'm not in any way involved. I don't really know anything any more about it than you do if you've been listening to the media. But there are a number of kind of relevant points that link to Regina's question, which is, well, how do you manage something as big, as a scene of that type? And it's now got to extraordinary size in Paris, where they've got literally tens of thousands of police officers involved in 2 different locations at least, I think, with potentially 2 different CAGs with lots of guns involved and so on and so forth. Now, I've never been involved in anything like that, but the nearest equivalent to that is that if I can use the word normal, but let's keep that kind of in inverted commas, and perhaps contrast a normal kind of serious crime, a homicide which might engage a large number of police officers and forensic practitioners and so on, and contrast that with something like a plane crash or a major terrorist incident, you will probably realize quite quickly that there is a very significant difference in scale there. And yes, that difference to scale is managed in a different way. The first thing really is that once you have multiple crime scenes of some significant size, you get to the kind of natural limits of what you can leave someone responsible for. And so there are some, in the UK, there are some structures that then come into place when you're dealing with what might be deemed to be a very large or complex crime scene, or perhaps even a series of crime scenes or civil disasters, civil incidents, like a plane crash or an explosion or a building collapse. What would happen if you have multiple crime scenes is that they would normally appoint a senior officer overall in charge of the entire incident, and for the management of the crime scenes they would appoint a crime scene manager to each crime scene. So imagine you had a number of quite say 4 or 5 different offences that are closely related and are in themselves quite big offences, and this is a sort of thing that's going on in Paris at the moment. You would appoint a crime scene manager to each of those crime scenes, and you would then appoint someone who is called a crime scene coordinator to kind of link across these multiple crime scenes. Why is this necessary? Well, there is a limit, of course, to just how much the human mind can manage and deal with in a kind of realistic time scale. And we know from past failings, and I'm going to come on to talk about this in a little bit, is that these structures are really important to ensure good two-way flow of information. So two-way, I mean information coming from the crime scene back to investigators, and information coming from investigators about ongoing developments that might be relevant to something that's occurring at the crime scene. Now, the best example of this we have that is documented and you can find and read into, even though it's a relatively old case, is the Yorkshire Ripper case, which I know that somebody mentioned in some of the comments because I saw it and responded to it. Now, in the Yorkshire Ripper case, now the person who was convicted in that particular investigation was a man called Peter Sutcliffe, and I don't recall the exact details, but he attacked 13 women, and I think he killed 9 women, and he was convicted in the early 80s. And one of the problems that occurred in that case was basically information overload. There was so much information in these pre-computer days that nobody had it in their mind. It wasn't being communicated effectively throughout the investigative team, which was enormous because these crimes covered several years, and as a consequence of that, several opportunities, not just one, several opportunities to arrest Sutcliffe and perhaps prevent a murder were missed. Now, it would also be fair to say this wasn't just an information problem. There was some really quite poor policing went on as well, so Sutcliffe was let off the hook really quite easily on a number of occasions. But that's just a good example of once a crime becomes of a particular size, it requires a much higher degree of coordination and attention to ensure that it is managed effectively and that people don't lose sight of what is actually going on. Okay, let's move on to another question. And this is from Anne Morris, and with comments from John Galvin and Gwen Hitchcock. And this is really about time. There are 2 questions here about time, and I'm going to treat them separately because they're effectively different dimensions of the investigation process, whether it's a crime scene or whether it's in a laboratory or elsewhere. And the question that Anne puts is, well, what is the time frame for solving an incident? How long is it studied, is the word Anne used, before a case is closed, even if it isn't solved? Well, the short answer to that is it depends. It depends very much on the incident and the particular circumstances surrounding the incident. Some cases are solved very quickly. I don't want to cause any anxiety, but with homicides, most people are killed by people that know them, so an adequate investigation will probably get to the bottom of that relatively quickly, possibly within hours, likely within weeks, and certainly within months in the vast majority of instances. Homicides, the clear-up rate for homicides in the UK is in excess of 90%, so it's quite rare for a case to go unsolved. But some cases take much longer, even years. So some cases, for whatever reason, take considerably longer to unfold and to investigate and to establish. And that might be because there's not sufficient evidence there, or there isn't the technology to analyse the evidence, or that it's just a particularly complex set of circumstances, and perhaps the offender has been lucky and just managed to escape police attention quite quickly. Now, the other point that Anne raises is, well, when do you close them down if you don't solve them? Well, in these days, cases are really never closed. You know, serious offences are continually reviewed, particularly homicides. This kind of process has been going on for many years, but it's been kind of accelerated and consolidated by a whole burst of what are sometimes called cold cases that were solved, often using DNA technology, since the mid-90s forward. So most large police organisations in the UK and around the world will have a case review team. Sometimes they're called a cold case review team, sometimes they're just called a homicide review team or whatever. And the bottom line there is that these cases are never really allowed to go cold. They are continually reviewed and refreshed and reconsidered in light of forthcoming information, changes in technology, changes in investigative processes, and changes in the law. So good practice, it would be fair to say, is that cases they might remain unsolved, but they don't become closed, and nobody kind of gives up on them. Now, I'm going to say a few more words about case reviews because I think it's probably quite important, and it kind of links to the second question about, or the question about human nature and how we control these things. I've already mentioned that many cases were resolved using DNA, but a significant proportion of cold cases are not resolved by technology or forensic evidence. They're resolved because some poor investigative practice is corrected in the new investigation. So in a cold case review, a completely new team is created. It may not be a large team, and often case review units in police organisations are quite a small number of people. But they are new people. The whole point of this review is to look at the case afresh. They don't make any assumptions. They ideally go back to first principles. You know, in other words, they go back to the crime scene. They go back to the original items, the exhibits that were examined. They go back to the original witnesses and speak to them again, because what has been shown is that you get this phenomenon which is sometimes referred to as embedded hypotheses, where a position about a case becomes embedded in a team even though it's not true. Now, there are a number of examples of this. Let me just give you one example from my own personal experience. I was involved in a review of a 25-year-old case where the weapon in the case was an incident where a woman was murdered and had very violent facial injuries, and the police had a working assumption that a very large piece of wood was the weapon. Now, how that came about, I don't know, because this was 25 years before I became involved. But that was not the weapon in the case. When a photograph of that item was shown to the pathologist 25 years later, he instantly said that weapon could not have caused these injuries. But somehow that had become embedded in the investigative team's thinking. And again, you know, there are other examples of that. It's not common, but neither is it rare. So in cold case reviews and in case reviews, some of the issues that need to be corrected are not to do with technology. They are to do with changes or better investigative practices. Okay, let's move on to a kind of another kind of dimension in that question, which comes from, in fact, excuse me, I need to go through my papers here. This is from Anne Morris. I think I might be repeating myself here, so I'm going to stop there because I think I might have lost the name of the person who posted the question. But the question really is about how long it takes to examine things in laboratories and to process crime scenes. So I'm moving on from how long it takes to perhaps investigate or solve a crime to how long it takes to produce forensic evidence, as there are two different questions. And again, the first answer, the first and simple, almost superficial answer is it depends. In some instances, the evidence can be produced incredibly quickly. So DNA evidence can be, in some instances, produced in hours, but more typically, perhaps a few days. And that can be the same for other types of examinations as well. And what typically happens in a homicide investigation is that certain particular examinations that are submitted to the forensic science laboratory are prioritized, and the scientist is very alert to the specific items that need to be examined before any other items. And they are often relate to perhaps important investigative issues, to perhaps establish that, for example, a finger mark in blood at the scene matches a particular individual, or that the blood in which the finger mark is the blood of the victim. And then once that is established, that then acts as a prima facie case against the individual, who may well be detained in custody, and then the rest of the examination then proceeds on a kind of slower basis. Not a slow basis, a slower basis. Now, that's a general answer, but then there is issues about particular types of evidence, because some evidence you can make sense of and examine really quite quickly. DNA is a goodish example. Standard DNA profiling is a good example. Finger marks, fingerprints is quite a good example. That can be done really quite quickly as well. But trace evidence, for example, fibers examinations, can't be done that quickly in most instances. So, for example, if you need to establish on the basis of fiber transfer that someone has been in a vehicle, or that two people have been in contact, it takes much longer. If you just think about this, the way you do this is you have to recover the fibers from the clothing. Now, searching an item for fibers is like, looking at a football field for a small coin. It has to be done in very, very slowly, because you don't want to miss any. And so it just takes a long time, and that's just finding the fibers. That's before you compare them with the relevant control samples, before you analyze them, and before you make any sense of them. So typically it will take weeks and sometimes months for fibers or trace type evidence to be forthcoming. And I'm going to link this back to James's comments right at the outset. That was James Dunn, and he mentioned privatization. So I said that the only country in the world that has privatized all of its forensic services is England and Wales. And why that took place, in my view, is not that clear. And what it means in terms of the delivery of forensic science, well, let's say what it means in terms of the quality of forensic science is not entirely clear yet, and it will take some time to be established. But what is quite obviously clear and very different is that the provision of the timing of forensic science, the production of evidence, is much, much faster in a privatized system than it is in a public sector system. So public sector laboratories typically have backlogs, and very often they are enormous backlogs, sometimes months and months and months. And this is a source of huge frustration to many investigators for understandable reasons. That is not the case in England and Wales, where in fact evidence is turned around remarkably quickly. So it is not a the question about whether privatization is a positive or a negative thing is not a simple question. There are many areas of service provision that are privatized. Health sector in many countries, the airlines are all pretty much all privatized, or many throughout the world, and we quite happily fly in these airlines. So it's a mistaken assumption to assume that because something is privatized that it's negative. And in fact, there are some quite clear benefits. So I have used up the questions that you had originally sent me. So I'm now going to take a look at some of the questions that are coming through in Twitter, just literally for the last couple of minutes, and see if I can make sense of these. Just excuse me while I kind of look at the other part of my screen. So let me give you some idea of the kind of questions that are coming through here. What percentage of murders are committed by someone that they know? Well, I've probably already answered that one. In most instances, people are killed by people they know, in fact, by people in their own families. And that makes for a very complicated situation in the investigation of a crime when you know that the loved ones of the victim may well be their killer. So they have, and whilst some of the victim's family may well be grieving, there may well be someone in amongst them who is actually the killer. So it's a particularly tricky thing to do. So the majority of people are killed by someone they know. And then I have a question that was from Sarah Barber, and then there's a question from John Brown. How often does a fresh forensic scientist review the evidence? Well, again, I've probably touched on that one as well. I have reviewed quite a few cases for both the prosecution and the defence, and that is generally at the request of the particular organisations involved. So it very much depends on the nature of the case. If it's a prosecution and someone's already convicted and it's considered to be relatively safe, then there is no particular need to review that again. But many cases, as you will probably know, remain controversial and are reviewed quite frequently. Let me look at some of these other questions now. Excuse me. Okay, and this is probably, I think, the last question I'll answer. And the issue that's been raised by Helena Durham is about admissible evidence. Now, I think we'll come on to the issue of admissibility later on in the MOOC. And I should say, firstly, for those of you who exist in adversarial legal systems, and that would be, for example, the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and so quite significant parts of the world, there will be something called the rules of admissibility. For those of you who live in what I refer to as continental or civil jurisdictions, or sometimes that operate under what they call the Napoleonic Code, you will not have rules of admissibility. Admissible evidence is something where the rules of admissibility control what evidence can go into adversarial legal systems, but in the civil or inquisitorial legal systems, they have a very different approach. So philosophically, the adversarial legal systems think that certain evidence is potentially prejudicial, so it's excluded. So, for example, testimony of that's a bad example, so I'm not going to do it. So they will tend to exclude evidence that is potentially prejudicial. Whereas in inquisitorial legal systems, they will simply hear the evidence and then decide whether it is significant, contributes, and assess any potential prejudice that goes with it. This is because the courts in these two different families of legal systems operate under very, very different procedures. The inquisitorial systems, the court proceedings are directed by a judge, whereas in adversarial systems, they are essentially an argument between two parties, one of whom is asserting that someone is guilty of a particular offence and someone who is there defending that individual. Now, they don't necessarily have to have an explanation for why that individual has been arrested, but they are there to represent their position if it is necessary. I think we are just about out of time here, so I think it would probably make sense for me to wind up by saying thank you very much for a whole range of extremely interesting questions, um, which required quite a lot of thought to do them justice in terms of answers, and demonstrates to me that the level of engagement in the program. So my impression is that you are highly engaged, and I hope that means that you're enjoying it, and I hope that you remain engaged, and I hope you continue to enjoy it, and we'll see how it goes in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Professor Fraser. We look forward to receiving your feedback. Don't forget you could use Twitter to contact us with any feedback and comments you may have regarding the course using the hashtag FLForensic. We look forward to seeing you all at the next Google Hangout. We hope you enjoy week 2. From the University of Strathclyde, thank you and goodbye.